Hi everyone, so we have 8 slides here which are an explainer about carbonates, karst, and how that relates to hydrogeology. On the first slide you can see a global map of karst extent, 2 different types of shading here, which shows the karst which is exposed on the surface, which is in black, and then karst which is present as aquifers but not present if you walk over the surface in the lighter grey colour. And you can see it covers a large proportion of the Earth's surface, particularly in Europe and particularly in Asia as well. So karst and karst aquifers provide a substantially important, significant global water resource, and we need to be able to understand that and model that. I'd like to start by drawing your attention to this paper that has just been published in the Hydrogeology Journal. It's a large global collaboration by the karst hydrogeology community just to map the global distribution of carbonate rocks, limestones, and the karst water resources. And I've just provided the abstract for you here just so you can get some figures about the importance of this rock type and why we're covering it here. So this new mapping initiative, the group has calculated that about 15% of the global ice-free continental surface has karstified carbonate rock. And in Europe, the percentage is almost 22%, and in terms of absolute area, the largest absolute area occurs in Asia, where there's 8.35 million kilometers squared of karstified rock. And in terms of water resources, globally 1.18 billion people, or 16.5% of the global population, live on karst. And the highest absolute number occurs in Asia, and the highest percentages are in Europe and North America, where almost 1/4 of the people live on karst. Now, not all those communities or those peoples will rely on the groundwater resource, but in many parts of the world they do. So I need to explain something about carbonate rocks and why they're unique and why they karstify. And in general, when we talk about carbonate rocks, we're going to talk about limestone, which is calcium carbonate. There are other carbonate rock types, they're less important globally. And the important point is that carbonate rocks can dissolve, and they can dissolve much more readily than most other rock types. And it's that dissolution that then leads to the formation of conduits and caves, which then allow for rapid and hard to predict water movement. This dissolution of carbonates comes from carbon dioxide gas, which dissolves in water to form a carbonic acid. And this carbon dioxide gas is largely sourced from the soil zone. And it's there because of plant roots respiring and soil microbes respiring, just the same as we respire. And they respire carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide concentrations of gas in soils in the shallow subsurface can be many orders of magnitude higher than the atmosphere that we breathe. So you have this ability for the soil zone to have high concentrations of carbon dioxide, then rainfall percolates through the soil, it then produces this carbonic acid, this dissolves the limestone, and it becomes solutionally widened, conduits form. The example on the right is from a classic karst terrain. This is actually taken from Europe. There's some spectacular terrains across Southeast Asia and China in particular, and to some extent here in Australia as well in our karst areas. But in this example you can see a bare surface. There's no soil. Soil's actually been removed, probably by overgrazing by humans in the last 1,000 years. So it exposes the rock underneath, and you can see the fractures in the rock, and these have been solutionally widened. These would originally just be a standard fracture that you might see, say, in the sandstone in the Sydney Basin. It's not widened or opened up, but here you can see it's maybe 5, 10, 20 centimeters wide, And if you have water flowing over the surface, it's rapidly going to percolate underground into the subsurface and continue dissolving until it runs out of its excess carbon dioxide and form cave systems underground and rapidly move water around. So this is what a karst aquifer system might look like. It's a classic conceptual figure used for teaching that has everything that you might possibly see, and in the real world you might see just some of these features, not all of them, but it's really very good for visualization and for teaching. And you can also conceptualize this block of karst as a volume that you might be trying to model in a conventional mathematical model, and you can hopefully then see all the many complex processes you'd have to try and parameterize and code if you're going to use a finite difference or finite element modeling methodology. It's just too complicated. So there's some standard features of the karst. I'll start from the top of the image and work my way down. So on the surface, there's something called the epikarst zone, and you'll see that word used a lot in the karst literature. The other word you might be familiar with is epidermis, which is the outer skin layer. So epi is the outer layer of the karst. That's where the word comes from. And the epikarst zone is often more fractured because it's nearer the Earth's surface and there's more physical weathering of the rock. So the temperature changes more, you might have more surface erosion going on. So that's a classic feature that you might see. You'll also see these open joints on the surface, and that was the last picture that I showed you, where the fractures and the joints in the surface have been solutionally opened due to the dissolution of the carbonate. You also find that because water can flow rapidly from the surface to the subsurface, it forms things called closed depressions, also called dolines. And so you can get very focused areas of groundwater recharge, because as soon as you form a surface depression, the water will continue to flow down slope into it, and they basically self-form or grow by their own momentum. So once you have a closed depression, it will keep on growing. In the subsurface, we have some conduits, and there's something labeled relict cave passage with speleothems. So the relict passage is a former conduit that used to carry water. In this case, it looks like it's connected to the closed depression, but now the water table is lower. And that could be a cave, which could be a tourist cave, and you might walk into today or explore today. On the left-hand side, we have the vadose zone labeled, which, as I mentioned previously, is the unsaturated zone from the surface all the way down to the water table. And in the water table, in the karst literature, often it's also called the phreatic zone, or the phreas. So this is the saturated zone. And on the bottom right-hand side, we see some caves which are still part of the active hydrogeological system. There's a cave in the phreatic zone, and there's water running through it. Finally, on the right-hand side, there's something called the vadose shaft, which is a former water conduit, which is vertical, and it's going through the vadose zone, and it's directing water directly to the subsurface. If we tried to model this system, we wouldn't know where any of these features are. So unless we can walk into the cave, or unless we can apply some geophysical technique to the near surface to try and find some voids, we really wouldn't know what's in there. Hence, the best thing that we normally do is have a lumped parameter modeling approach, and we take that whole block as one, and we find some basic explanatory variables that can then explain the water movement or water level variations in that whole block. The final thing I'll define, just for completeness, on the right-hand side, the relict passage has speleothems in it. Speleothems is the technical word for cave calcium carbonate precipitates. These are things such as stalagmites and stalactites. They can be quite interesting as well, because when a stalagmite is forming, there has to be water movement from the surface to the subsurface. So if we can find out when these stalagmites and stalactites formed in the past, we can provide some evidence of past groundwater recharge. I'll finish with a couple of pictures of karst, just so you can see how complex and varied it is across the world. On the left-hand side is a picture of a quarry that's now abandoned, and it's at a place called Wombian in New South Wales, and some people may have been there. It's within a national park, and the caves are accessible for tourism. And the quarry face here has exposed the structure of the karst. And towards the top of this quarry face, you can see the trees growing on the surface, and you can see a whole bunch of darker areas, which are the old conduits where the water used to flow from the surface to the subsurface. They're not used anymore. The quarry has taken place. The water level is now much lower, so they're abandoned. But you can see the complexity of the water movement there. A lot of the water movement would have been nearly horizontal. There's a lot of horizontal structures. Very few of these conduits are going deeper into the limestone. The limestone here is actually also technically a marble, so it's been slightly metamorphosed, and that means that it hasn't got much primary porosity left. The water can't move through the pores or the matrix, so any water movement that happened at this site would have to move through the conduits. Finally, in the previous slides, I talked about this epikarst, this surface zone where there's extra weathering and fractures, and maybe that's why the conduits are near the surface. So maybe there were fractures nearer the surface, and they have been solutionally widened over the millennia, and we can't actually see the original fractures in the epikarst anymore. They've been dissolved out. On the right hand side, a much younger limestone. This is from Texas in the United States, and you can still see some bedding structures here, which are horizontal. You can see some relatively porous layers near the surface. You can see that the whole thing is pretty weathered and rotten, so this is quite a thick epikarst. And so in this karst system, we'll have water movement through the pores, through the matrix, and also through the fractures, but the fractures are less well developed here. So you can treat these pictures as almost two types of end members of karst systems. On the left, our very old limestone is turned to marble, very little primary porosity left, the water will move through the fractures, and we have to model that. On the right hand side, we have a younger limestone system. Primary porosity remains, water can percolate between the pores, but also through the fractures, but the fractures appear to be less opened up, less solubilized, and so this is going to have a different groundwater flow process. Hence the need for lump parameter modelling to try and subsume all of these complexities into a simplistic, parsimonious model that works for each individual karst.